So Conscient Podcast, episode 90. I'm in Toronto this week. I'm with Shannon Litzenberger, who's a colleague of mine in the sense that over the years at the council, when I was at the Canada Council, we would interact. We had a call a few weeks ago that really excited me about what you're going to talk about today, which is a paper that I think will be published soon. And you just gave a long and wonderful panel discussion with distinguished guests. And I'll put the link to that because that's going to be available on YouTube through an organization called CPAMO. Let's start at the beginning, Shannon, and just have you introduce yourself to us, what you do, where you come from, and then we'll jump into the paper, knowing that I have a recording of it, and I'm going to insert parts of your presentation. I encourage people to actually read it, right? And actually not only read it, but give you and others feedback, because I see it as a discussion paper. I see it as an instigation of dialogue, and I think you've stuck your neck out, so to speak, pretty well. And I admire that. I think that's the right thing to do, is to take some of those complex issues and put them out there and have people respond in dialogue. Anyway, who are you, Shannon?
Thank you. So I'm a dance artist. I'm a choreographer, director, and also an embodiment facilitator. And as you pointed out, someone who's also been fairly invested in arts advocacy and policy development over the years. I've kind of come in and out of that space, but certainly during the pandemic, I was compelled to reflect, as many artists have during this time, so in the conversation about like what's happening in the arts, I'm really concerned with this conversation about what's happening with artists right now. We're in the offices of the Native Earth Performing Arts in Toronto, and I just want to acknowledge them because they're lending us their space. Also, the date today is December 8th, 2021. I always say that. So you just introduced yourself, Shannon. Now, tell me a bit about what the paper is, but also the origins. Like, why did you feel compelled to write this? And then you can tell us, briefly what it's about, because it is quite extensive. But maybe start with what it is and why did you write it? Yeah, so the paper is asking this question: what would it mean to mobilize artists to do their most essential work in this moment of social transformation? And really, it's trying to look at what makes art essential in a society, and why is that important right now, right? Given the many crises that we find ourselves in. And so the origins of the paper really came from another panel, actually, that I was invited to moderate last May through CPAMO and their Gathering Divergence Festival, which happens semi-annually. And so that panel was also exploring this issue of how IBPOC artists, in this case, and the things that they're experiencing and the things that they need can be more centered in the conversation around social justice and around change. And so in preparation to moderate that panel, I started to gather some thoughts that really I had been thinking over the whole of the pandemic. Which is about, what is this situation we find ourselves in actually as artists? Like, how do we situate ourselves inside the moment of crisis? And aren't these questions, these questions of society, and these questions of how we are together, and questions of our values and organizing principles, like, aren't these things that we actually work with all the time in our artistic practices? And maybe there's some magic to be mined in that at this moment. And so I had given a kind of introductory set of remarks at that panel in May, and then that set of remarks grew into a fairly substantive essay. And to be honest, I presented today an abbreviated version of what it was, because it really grew. Like, the central thrust was really about artists as world makers, and that's something I've been thinking about for a very long time, and have been in lots of conversations about among artists over the last few years, actually.
Well, let's listen now to you reciting or presenting some of the paper, and then people get an idea of what it's about, and you won't have to explain it all.
As restrictions are lifted and we are allowed once again to stage our plays, mount our choreographies, host our galas, and open our exhibitions, how will we avoid sliding back into the habits of a world we know is oppressive, inequitable, and unsustainable? as a community of culture makers? How do we work at the level of culture change as a priority in order to fully embody the world we aspire to? These questions have been at the center of my pandemic-inspired reflections. As a practicing dance artist, embodiment facilitator, change maker, policy thinker, and longtime arts advocate, I'm invested in the role artists have to play in this moment of reemergence and social transformation. I believe that artists are world makers and that this work is critical right now. I also believe that artists are not adequately centered or supported in the professional arts ecosystem, nor have they been ambitiously mobilized as change agents during this time of crisis, much to the detriment of the arts and to society at large. My response to this dilemma is a call for radical experimentation, both to artists and to those who make decisions about the systems that organize our work.
And then I started really thinking about what surrounds that. And of course, my policy advocacy mind also went to this relationship between self and system, right? I think this relationship between self and system is one that I've been querying my entire career, I would say. And more recently through the lens of embodiment practice, which is something I'm really invested in as a dance artist, which looks at this, how does the system shape us to be, this question of beingness. And so that also became really part of the inquiry in the paper is, what do artists do and how have we been shaped by this world? And then how do we disrupt that thing that has shaped us?
So that's a first excerpt. Maybe just break into 4 blocks because they speak in a way to the issues that you're most interested in.
Yeah, so the essay is divided into 4 parts. So the first part is really about the state of precarity that artists find themselves in. So it's really asking about, is this an emergency or are we in a state of emergence? The second part is about culture as a colonial project or culture as a lever for change. The third part is about artists as world makers. And the fourth part is about letting go of the current system in order to build the next one. Part 1, the alienated state of the artist, an emergency and a revolution in the making. The role of the artist is that of the soldier of the revolution. Diego Rivera. The experience we are living through is simultaneously an emergency and a revolution in the making. While these phenomena often go hand in hand, they create a contradiction in the way we, as individuals and as a society, might respond. In an emergency, our nature is to stabilize, to mitigate damage, to prioritize survival. And in a revolution, we mobilize, we disrupt, and we set fire to the establishment. While governments, businesses, and many public service organizations continue to lead emergency response strategies, many artists are at the center of the activism and community organizing that is fueling a revolution. Here, we find ourselves in a moment of paradox where the systems are trying to preserve themselves while artists are joining a mounting resistance. It may seem contradictory, but there is a reason that emergency and emergence share an etymological root. The Latin root means to rise, to bring to light. What if this paradox is exactly the alchemy that could bring about the social transformation we so desperately need? What would it mean for a society to offer its artists the agency, resources, and support they need to do their work well and fully, and with the aim of catalyzing transformative change? First, we might start by expanding our view beyond the notion that artists are creative unicorns here to entertain, distract, and comfort us, as popular media has suggested through the pandemic. While comfort, distraction, and entertainment have been the emotional crutches of too many months in lockdown, the work of artists is much more fundamental in this moment. The role of the artist in a time of transition is, most essentially, one of catalyzing emergence. The processes inherent in art making are essential right now because we are in a moment where an old world is collapsing and a new world has yet to emerge. We need people who are practiced in the art of working collaboratively and across differences in a highly volatile set of conditions, able to venture into the unknown with the aim of creation. Cycles of history tell us that artists have always been at the forefront in moments of social transformation. In her book, Funny Weather, Art in an Emergency, author Olivia Lang wrote that art shapes our ethical landscapes. It opens us to the interior lives of others. It is a training ground for possibility. It makes plain inequalities, and it offers other ways of living. Indeed, art is a process of transformation concerned with collective human development. Art thrives in the what-if questions and relishes the learning of each experiment. Art is both a barometer and a process of social transformation. As we consider the potential role of artists as agents of change, as healers, as animators of the public imagination, as world makers, can we first turn our gaze toward the experience of artists inside this moment of great disruption? How are artists doing right now? Are they thriving? Are they being ambitiously mobilized to do their most essential work? It's an understatement to say that the pandemic has been devastating for the arts, though it has been particularly ruinous for artists. Through the pandemic, emergency response strategies in the arts have deployed ample resources to institutions and organizations to ensure their survival. But what about the survival of artists? Here's a snapshot of artists during the pandemic. 62% reported high levels of stress or total burnout. Artists lost an average of 36 opportunities, amounting to over $25,000 of income. 63% of all cultural workers accessed CERB, and for many artists I know, this was a more stable and significant income than in pre-pandemic times. Even before the pandemic, artists were so poorly compensated that pursuing a career in the arts hasn't been viable or sustainable without significant financial subsidization for some time. Artists are the worst compensated workers in our field, regularly exploited economically to help keep the engine of the arts and culture sector running. In 2016, the median income of artists was 44% lower than the median income of all Canadian workers, while cultural workers in general have median incomes much closer to the Canadian norm at 6% lower than all workers. I live in Toronto, where 69% of artists make less than Toronto's living wage of $45,000 per year, and half make less than $30,000 according to Toronto Art Stats 2019. While $45,000 is the benchmark for a living wage in Toronto, the typical person needs over $69,000 in income to afford to rent a one-bedroom apartment in the city. 72% of us work on a freelance or contract basis and have incomes from multiple arts-related sources. To make ends meet, we also have additional part or full-time jobs within and in growing numbers outside the arts. We are overworked, and we no longer believe we can survive here, and so we are leaving. Like me, 69% of artists moved to Toronto to pursue their careers, while only 28% were born here. The need to work in proximity to robust arts markets in community with fellow arts professionals is, for so many, now outweighed by a need to survive, to pay rent, to buy groceries. Anecdotally, we know that artists are also leaving the field altogether. In his new book, The Death of the Artist, essayist and critic William Dershowitz deftly describes several evolving market conditions that have adversely impacted artists in North American society. First, thanks to monopolizing tech companies, vast amounts of profits have been redirected away from creators toward distributors, leaving artists chronically underpaid for their work, even at considerable scale. More nefariously, art in the digital age has been steadily demonetized, expected for free, or at shockingly low cost. How do we reconcile this expectation with the call to ramp up the creation and dissemination of digital content? Second, artists work for free behind the scenes in order to access the limited and mostly underpaid opportunities offered to them in the arts marketplace. Artists know they must appeal to the gatekeepers of the art world capable of making them stand out in an oversaturated attention economy. Funders, presenters, curators, and programmers all deploy resources, space, money, access to audiences in support of the artist's work. Gaining access to these resources requires an enormous amount of time and labor while producing painfully low rates of return. Having a career as an artist has become as laborious as running a small, under-resourced arts organization, but with fewer resources. Artists are working for free, sourcing opportunities, writing proposals, self-promoting, networking with presenters, producers, gallerists, and publishers, and more. This is to say nothing of ongoing training, finding ways to stay creatively inspired, and time for unstructured, open-ended imagining. Finally, the often hidden truth Dershowitz makes explicit is that economic advantages within the system are essential for professional viability, let alone success. Advantages like spousal or family support means spending more time on pursuing art and less on other activities required for survival. Having privileged access to donor networks, promoters, producers, and other market gatekeepers also improves the likelihood of standing out in the crowd. These advantages significantly increase the potential for professional viability, and these are class-based privileges with implications that cut across dimensions of social location. Given these realities, Canadian artists and many of their supporters are advocating for a guaranteed basic income. How else to level the playing field inside an industry so deeply entrenched in the dynamics of neoliberal capitalism and its inherent inequities? But let's be clear that the call to arms for social relief for artists is only made necessary by the way the system is exploiting them to begin with. In the same way that late-stage capitalism is amplifying wealth inequality and therefore heightening the demand for social supports across many facets of society, a guaranteed basic income for artists is necessary because our system of cultural production has so significantly eroded the value of the arts and disabled the artist's ability to make a livable income in this system. The precarious economic situation of the artist is very much putting at stake the ability of the arts to retain its independence and freely express its truth. What then is at stake for a society when artists are no longer to freely express their truths? What happens when artists no longer have time to steep themselves in imagination? When they are too mired in trying to stay afloat economically in order to ever contemplate, reflect, experiment, and allow newness to emerge? One of the greatest challenges artists face at this moment is that the industry we work in is steeped in the rules, dynamics, and cultural norms that we are seeking to disrupt. Our near impossible task is to disentangle ourselves from a worldview that celebrates the individual over the collective, that chases production, progress, and economic growth at the expense of human and planetary health, that uses power as a form of dominance and control, instead of as an abundant source of fuel that catalyzes our individual and collective ability to achieve purpose, and that commodifies every gift of our shared existence from the water we drink to our time, attention, and labor. In this world, art as a way of knowing is devalued. Art as a process of imagining new worlds is relegated to the realm of entertainment and distraction. Artists are reduced to producers of commodities, invested in by governments to fuel economic development. If we as a culture sector don't experiment radically with ways of disrupting this worldview, we will inevitably continue to propagate it. Decolonization is presencing what is absent. Malini Goodchild. Developing Canada's nationhood through a robust, government-sponsored system of cultural production has been a highly effective strategy of the colonial project. The Massey Commission of the 1950s gave birth to a Canadian culture distinct from our American neighbours and reflective of Canada's British and French colonial roots. Today, we can look back on a considerable legacy of national cultural institutions, Canadian-made artwork, and Canadian art heroes that were seeded and nurtured by the state. The truth of this legacy, however, the legacy of the nation we call Canada, is that it came at an unconscionable cost to human life and dignity. In the name of creating a national culture, Canada was simultaneously enacting a cultural genocide. The systematic erasure of Indigenous peoples, along with their cultures and languages, is a shameful and devastating part of our legacy of nation building, as is the enslavement of Black peoples, the subjugation of Japanese, Chinese, and South Asian populations through indentured labor, and the oppression of Jewish and other ethnic minority people and cultures. At this moment, we must face the appalling truth about the process of creation that made Canada, a process that enacted egregious atrocities against human life. Today, in this increasingly pluralistic, post-nationalist society colonially known as Canada, it is essential that Canada support cultural sovereignty for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. We must honor the TRC calls to action, as well as the recommendations for justice in the report on missing and murdered Indigenous women. The work of cultural transformation cannot begin without it. To build a new foundation of cultural democracy for a future Canada, we must reimagine cultural policies in support of a much more pluralistic expression of the socio-cultural context we share. To do this, we simply cannot continue to privilege classical Eurocentric art aesthetics by disproportionately distributing funds to the largest arts institutions that promote them. Art forms like ballet, opera, classical music, and a historical canon of European visual art have a place in the Canadian cultural landscape. Their state-sponsored dominance, however, can no longer be justified. The fact that these institutions are frequented primarily by affluent patrons, receive annual government grants and private donations totaling in the millions each year, benefit uniquely from taxpayer-matched endowment funds, and operate at a scale exponentially greater than most others in the field is impossible to reconcile with the imperative of building a cultural democracy. While these institutions consume the lion's share of resources, the rest of us, working across a broad range of cultural forms and practices, collectively reaching a highly diverse group of people and communities, remain relegated to the grassroots battlegrounds. Here, we work in a domain of highly competitive, all-or-nothing project funding, micro-granting, and GoFundMe campaigns. While some organizations occupy a more comfortable middle ground with regular and predictable government funding, they also struggle to fulfill an essential bridging role across a widening gap in the so-called ecosystem between the best and worst resourced players. In many cases, these mid-scale organizations are the pseudo-institutions of a particular cultural context or form of practice, playing a critical role within the field that extends beyond a typical creation and production mandate. While disheartening, this should be no surprise, because Canada's cultural policies were never designed to reflect the context or processes of a wide range of cultural expressions present in our country's diversifying population. Significant historical inequities remain, despite the ways in which policies have shifted incrementally over time to include support for a more diverse palette of cultural expression. The multicultural society proposed by Canada's expanded cultural policy project is still very much imbued with the features and organizing principles of colonialism. It has been a project of othering, where a dominant Eurocentric culture retains its centrality. Decades of advocacy efforts on the part of under-supported artists and equity-seeking groups continue today under the banner of sovereignty, anti-oppression, anti-racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. However, diverse human and cultural identities simply represented within a colonial white supremacist heteropatriarchal system risk being exotified, tokenized, and co-opted to further the original aims of the colonial project. Representation within the system as it was designed risks producing the same old outcomes. It's the very design of the system we need to concern ourselves with. To design a more just system, one that more equally distributes the benefits and burdens it produces, we can't simply recalibrate an old system to become more fair and efficient, nor can we simply reorganize the distribution of power along identity lines, maintaining the existing architecture. We need to engage in a more fundamental process of creation organized around principles of cultural plurality, equity and justice, sustainability, creative engagement, collective care and well-being, and others. Radical disruption in the arts means re-evaluating things like standards of artistic excellence, measures of public value, and economic viability. It means unpacking the implicit biases hidden underneath notions of talent and merit. It means challenging hierarchies and reorganizing power structures so that shifts in policy and resource distribution will be informed by a plurality of cultural experiences and aesthetics. This is how we start to shift away from a system that has been aligned with a Western worldview inside a neoliberal capitalist system. In recent years, there has been a growing attention to the imperative of updating Canada's cultural policy framework by replacing the outdated narratives of the 70-year-old Massey Report. Indeed, reimagining the rules of the system and the ways in which those rules govern the distribution of coveted resources is critical, but only part of the equation. What must be disrupted are the patterns of behavior the current system has conditioned. We in the arts embody the rules and dynamics we have been shaped by. We have been enculturated by this system, and our most challenging project is to disentangle ourselves from the habits of being this system has shaped us to carry out. To let go of the habits that reify and perpetuate the old system and embrace ways of being that will shape a future world, we need to heal, learn, experiment, and practice. While policies and resources make change possible, practice is what makes change sustainable. The global social justice movement that was amplified following the murder of George Floyd in the US on May 25, 2020, has accelerated the urgency to create a new social contract that addresses the pervasiveness of racism and other social inequities woven through our social fabric. In Canada, the legacies of colonization are unfolding still today, and if we weren't aware before, the pandemic has shed light on any lingering ignorance. A health crisis, a policing crisis, a housing crisis, an economic crisis, a crisis of well-being, a crisis of spirit, a crisis of care. The need for a revolution couldn't be more of an emergency. In the arts, the call for a cultural transformation built on the momentum of the Idle No More, Me Too, Black Lives Matter, and Indigenous resurgent movements has helped to center and lift up the work of women, Indigenous, Black, POC, and other equity-seeking artists. However, it's important to acknowledge that for those in power, equity-seeking artists and their work have also become a new kind of cultural capital, ready to be leveraged through very fresh diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies. This might be a step toward the kind of long-term transformative change we are seeking, if it manages to resist becoming a passing fad, acting as a kind of public relations campaign in a moment of social justice consciousness. The work of building a culture liberated from the historical colonial ethos Canada is embedded in is a project for a generation or more. It involves working at the levels of self, structure, system, and culture. It involves visioning a cultural democracy capable of reflecting a culturally pluralistic citizenry in a post-colonial society. And for many arts organizations, the work of dismantling systems of oppression has only just begun. Relationships that bridge class and power divides are nascent, as are collective learning processes focused on embodying more inclusive, equitable cultures. Institutions will not likely lead the way toward a new world because of how entangled they are in the dynamics of the world that made them. The pursuit of reconciling historical inequities through diversified representation and policy reform has been the focus for many arts and culture organizations through the pandemic. This alone will be a failing strategy for our sector if the goal is long-term systemic change. Elizabeth Dory Tunstall, Dean of Design at OCAD-U, made this case elegantly in her recent keynote address at SPAMO's May 2021 Gathering Divergence Festival. As the first ever in the world Black female design school dean, she referred to herself as a super token, invited as a Black woman into a dominantly white institution. Diversity, she says, is being invited to the party. Inclusion is being invited to dance the dances the host knows, the foxtrot, the waltz. Equity is to make room for the dances she knows and to make dancing them a part of the culture that all members of the institution participate in. What her metaphor illustrates is that requesting better representation in a system designed to enact the same dynamics of oppression inherent in a wider system of heteropatriarchal white supremacy is an incomplete recipe for change. And in fact, becoming a super token inside organizations where real cultural shifts are not consciously in progress, leaders of color and other equity-seeking artists may find themselves more subjected to harm than empowered to lead change within the dynamics of elite social control so deeply embedded in the governance of the arts industry and its institutions. This was plainly evident throughout the aforementioned festival, where many Black artists and arts administrators spoke of these challenges. To really do the work of the revolution, we need to look beyond strategies of diversified representation and policy reform and work at the level of culture. We need to reshape our ways of being together across differences, divesting ourselves of the human hierarchy so present in our society. Resmaa Menakem, healer, best-selling author, and trauma specialist, reminds us that because culture lives in our bodies, cultural practice trumps all things cognitive, ideas, philosophies, convictions, principles, and laws. To work at the level of culture, we need to engage in embodied creative processes that work with the materials of meaning-making, rituals and symbols, codes of behavior, communal language and storytelling, rules of belonging. Working with such materials within the conditions we find ourselves in, of chaos, complexity, and constraint, helps us expand into new possibilities. This is the work of the artist. Through the transformative power of their creative practices, artists are especially and uniquely capable of catalyzing the kind of systems change we need right now by leading at the level of culture change. To do this well, artists need to uncouple themselves from the concepts, structures, and dynamics that are producing current systemic harms. Liberating ourselves from a system of oppression that we periodically benefit from is a significant act of resistance. And it is particularly difficult to enact either because of how precarious our professional artistic lives are to begin with, or because of our relative privilege within it. We rely on every and any small benefit afforded to us by the system. We work ourselves regularly into states of burnout. We never say no because we can't. We focus on artistic activities that have the best chance of being funded and promoted. We hang on tightly to the belief that over time it will get better and even easier, but it doesn't. The return on our emotional, spiritual, and creative investment is shockingly unacceptable. To transcend these dynamics where we artists are too often exploited in our own industry, we will need to experiment with new ways of working that are better aligned with the world we want to live in. Part 3. Artists as world makers. Art is an effort to create, beside the real world, a more humane world. André Marois.
To reimagine Canadian culture, what I'm proposing is the centering of the individual artist and their honed ability to experiment with emergent artistic practice as an organizing strategy during this transitional time between worlds. Returning to my earlier question, if artists were offered the agency, resources, and support to engage fully in the transformative potential of their creative practice, could they lead the way toward a new world? If we put more of our attention on individual artists concerned with emergence and less on the system concerned with the emergency, could we better catalyze change? Artistic process is, by its very nature, emergent. It is a process capable of world-making because it explores horizons of possibility in ways that engage our fully embodied sensory capacities, including our imagination. Creation processes value integrated forms of knowledge production, including intuition, perception, and emotion, in addition to conceptual thought. As such, these are processes capable of working on our ways of being, as well as on our ways of thinking and doing, all within the volatile conditions we find ourselves in, those of complexity, disconnection, and uncertainty. Processes that prioritize felt sense experience have been increasingly subjugated by our hyper-rational, data-driven culture of information overload. As such, they feel less and less familiar in our society as processes that support our collective evolution. However, these processes are integral to the creation of meaning, which in turn catalyzes change. As Seth Godin puts it in his 2015 audiobook, Leap First, Creating Work That Matters, to create meaning is to change something for the better. A meaningful artistic experience can move us toward new understanding, engagement, and action. Because of our practiced ability to create meaning, we artists can, and often do, disrupt old interpretations of a shared reality. We tell new stories, offer up new metaphors, and resituate familiar ideas in unfamiliar contexts. Through our processes of creation, we artists also spend time imagining futures that don't yet exist, priming the public imagination with an expanded set of possibilities for our shared existence. Artistic experiences invite a plurality of interpretations to emerge, contributing to the socialization of experiential knowledge about our collective existence, a fundamental tenet of a democratic society. When artists engage in processes of creation, something comes into existence that didn't exist before. Something new is invented. This process, according to Arts Action Research, is a unique combination of vision, creativity, intuition, and collaboration balanced with craft, technique, accountability, disciplines, and use of time and resources. The artistic process is, without qualification or quantification, the most effective planning, problem-solving, decision-making, relationship-building process available to anyone. Artistic processes are focused primarily on invention rather than innovation, though the two are often confused. According to Julia Kagansky, director of New Inc., the New Museum's Art, Technology, and Design Incubator, invention prompts us to imagine how things could be, offering new propositions that aren't bound by the realities of how things are. Innovation, however, is bound to what already exists. It is about optimizing and replicating and scaling, and it is deeply tied to organizing principles of efficiency, growth, competition, and maximizing profit. Innovation does not set out to build a new foundation for a new world. It proposes improvements built upon existing structures. How can we address imperatives of decoloniality, health and well-being, environmental and social justice, using the same tools and processes that created the conditions we find ourselves in to begin with? Audre Lorde said it best: "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." Kagansky goes on to say that focusing on innovation in a time of great change and disruption can limit our potential to explore, inviting only incremental change rather than the paradigm-shifting change that really opens us to new possibility.
Innovation, it seems, is a strategy connected to the emergency, while invention is about the revolution. If we want to disrupt and reimagine rather than optimize and improve the current system of cultural production, could we lean into processes focused on bringing something into existence that didn't exist before? In this moment of disruption, can we soften our attachment to production in order to experiment and learn? Can we stop working toward world premieres and openings as though they are an end game where art stops evolving? Can we hit pause on our impulse to innovate and instead steep ourselves for a moment in the chaotic realm of artistic creation? Artists are already experimenting with new ways of doing things. We are inviting new rituals, practicing new ways of collaborating, testing new rhythms, and investigating new organizing principles. These experiments are happening in studios and rehearsal halls, living rooms, and parks, all in service of culture change. Artistic processes are not always or often optimizable and repeatable because they are so relational and conditional. However, this makes them particularly relevant as catalysts for transformational change in a highly complex transitioning world. Artists know every creation is unique, embedded in a unique set of relationships and circumstances. To navigate the unknown territory of art making, artists often form communities where mutual support, learning, dialogue, exchange, and a sharing of resources occurs. From this initially chaotic and structured space, new insights come to life. This is heartening because to transition to a new world, we need a new how, an ontology that is aligned with our reclaimed understanding that we are relational beings that belong to and are a part of a larger natural planetary ecosystem. Unlike a strategy, model, or framework, an ontology is connected to the nature of how our reality is organized. Said differently, it is a way of being expressed through culture. It is a set of values and principles enacted in a multiplicity of ways. Unsurprisingly, multiplicity, this available abundance of perspectives, collides head-on with our conditioned Western ways of knowing. But if we continue to pursue the singular objective truths promised by Western Enlightenment thinking, we will miss the plethora of possible pathways to a new world. Making this shift is particularly challenging because it requires that we disrupt the way that we've conceived of our very reality, and even in spite of notable counter-narratives within, truths, in the plural, remain antithetical to the Western project at large. However, it is fundamental to a cultural democracy that the world we all belong to be reauthored through diverse expressions of the human experience. So it begins with, as clearly as possible, articulating, my perspective on the situation of artists. I mean, using lots of supporting statistics. But certainly that's a place in the essay where I hope that it feels resonant, where this experience, the invisible experiences of artists start to become visible in this moment, that actually artists are really not doing well and we are not attending enough to that situation, to the point where artists might actually be disabled from doing the most essential work that we need artists to do right now.
And you're not just talking about the recovery from COVID, you're talking about the general state of the arts sector and its relative precarity, but also you look at the opportunity for artists to step up, which is a more positive view, because you sort of denounce the precarity, but you also say there's opportunities for artists to play a much larger role.
Yes, and I think this is kind of the paradox of it, really, is that artists are in such a state of precarity right now, for the most part, that it's not really viable to have a career, that the extent to which artists are subsidizing the cultural sector at the moment is like an invisible contribution that artists are making through all of the unpaid labor it takes artists to just stay in their career. And so the paradox of that is that a way out of that is actually to try to funnel some of our energy toward collective organizing, toward a kind of supported and community organized form of change. But of course, because we're just like hamsters on a wheel in the system, it becomes almost impossible to direct any of those emotional, energetic resources towards collective organizing. And this is really the challenge for artists right now.
Well, we'll listen to more of your speech because it will fill in the gaps. Here's another excerpt.
Part 4. From emergency to emergence, detaching from the current system to build the next one. We are addicted to the highway because that's all modernity can offer us. We need to become fugitives. Bio Akomolafe. Our challenge as artists will be to become fugitives of this system of cultural production we are all embedded in. We will need to examine the habits of being we've adopted to survive in the old system, resisting conditioned tendencies that no longer serve us. Our near impossible task is to balance our competitive pursuit of scarce resources with the work of collective advancement. We need to work together to create a new vision for a world that doesn't yet exist. It is not enough to agree on all the ways the system is broken, creating harm and producing all the same outcomes it was designed for. If we want to do the work of transformation, we need to stop trying to win in a game designed to make sure most of us lose. This is, after all, how the system keeps us under control and on the periphery. Instead, we must direct at least some of our scarce emotional, spiritual, and creative resources toward a collective horizon. And we need to do this together across a spectrum of power and privilege. To dismantle the oppressive design of the current system, we artists need to soften our grip on the imperative of production, shift our relationship to time, and deepen our engagement in creative processes capable of remaking our world. Doesn't that sound wonderful? We need to experiment with processes of creation that center new values and then contribute our learning into a collective body of knowledge. We need to first get lost in the chaos of not knowing, creating the conditions for a new systems design to emerge. By insisting on space for creative experimentation and discovery, we can challenge the norms of the old world and disentangle ourselves from the concepts embedded in the current system. This is what we need to do to heal from the harms of an old world and expand into new possibilities. We can turn away from notions of artistic excellence and instead imagine new ways of understanding how art creates meaning in our lives. We can challenge concepts of explicit value, public impact, and evaluation when we engage with ways of knowing beyond what is measurable. We can mitigate the damaging effects of unrestrained extraction, progress, and growth by committing to the work of reconnection and reclamation, imagining a sustainable world. We can challenge the logic of hierarchy and dominance that holds the old system in place by continuing to engage equitably across differences as an essential condition of a healthy creative environment and therefore a healthy ecosystem. We can tell a new story about the essential role of the arts in society. This is the work of the revolution, and it is already underway. This work is not unprecedented. Throughout human history, there are examples of countercultures, organized resistance, and mobilization in times of crisis. We as artists need to claim a place of greater agency because the world needs us right now. Only then will we have the opportunity to set our terms. Governments and funders are actively deploying resources right now with a consciousness that the world of tomorrow needs to be different from the world of today. The mistake our system of cultural production keeps making over and over in this emergency is excluding a focus on radical experimentation with art-making practices as a lever for systems change. Artists are languishing, And what is not good for artists is not good for art. All of us working in this system of cultural production, funders, producers, policymakers, artists, presenters, researchers, educators, donors, we need to ask, what interventions can we make that will radically mobilize artists to do their most important work? Where within the system could these investments most effectively disrupt the status quo and seed change? One possibility is that various actors across the system of cultural production could direct more programs and resources toward experimentation and discovery over production and distribution. What could we learn if we took the time to understand how artists are working and what they are discovering, rather than simply what they are making and how successful it is in the cultural marketplace? And what could these lessons offer society at large as we all grapple with the existential challenges of our time? Another unexplored opportunity is to leverage the advantages of the arm's-length funding model in Canada that allows for the distribution of funds to individual artists and informal structures, groups, collectives, and networks, unconstrained by the more formally and colonial structured charitable not-for-profit model. The structures of the old world are the disabling constraint of the emergent ways of the new. We need to limit funding that amplifies and perpetuates old world models, and instead prioritize and grow pools of funding for supporting process-based research and experimentation uncoupled from ultimate goals of production and distribution so we can learn. Arts funders can participate in this work by directing internal resources toward better understanding the role and impact of artist-led activities within the ecosystem, analyzing data collected from funding applications that to date remain inert as a catalyst for shared understanding or change.
Well, I'll have to say, I'll be honest with you, I think you've bitten off a big piece here, because you're essentially challenging the hand that feeds us.
That's right.
In a way.
Yeah, and that's really scary, actually. And that is one of the things that I thought about through the pandemic, that for the first time in my career, I'm actually finding myself not working inside or in relationship to cultural institutions as I have been for quite a long while through my career. And at the moment, I've really found allyship actually in SEPAMO and its work, and the work of artists who are engaged in the social justice movement, because I think this is actually, the thing that I feel like I've been working on my whole career, which is like, what is this thing that underlies all of that produces these outcomes, was just really animated and made visible in this moment of the pandemic through the social justice movement, but also through the climate emergency, and also through the lens of, the declining sense of well-being that we're all feeling, that I feel as an artist, as just a person in the world right now, at this stage of the pandemic. And so, these things just started to come out. I am not a writer. I'm a dancer. And so it's taken me a fair amount of labor to actually try to articulate these thoughts. And the essay had many iterations in order to arrive at this point. But it's sort of my best attempt right now at trying to point as clearly as I can to what's going on and start a conversation with a few ideas about what we might do about it. And truly, my hope is that artists will feel resonant with this in some ways. Like, really, I feel like that's the core audience, is artists, and secondarily, like, other actors in the system of cultural production. And so, but it's kind of a gift also to have the freedom to just say the thing. And I'm presenting it as an essay. I'm presenting it as a point of view. But my hope is that it's opening a door.
Well, let's listen to the conclusion of your paper, and that will give, again, an idea of what you want people to take away from it, because so I'll tell you in a second what I think we should take away from it.
Finally, we need to create new social support systems for artists so they can pursue careers that have a chance at being viable. Having time and space to run the business of our careers is paramount to having one in the first place. Until artists are compensated for their work in a way that adequately supports both the direct and indirect costs of making it, we will continue to endorse a stratified system where only those with economic privileges can be artists. Social support such as guaranteed basic income will better enable artists to participate equitably as engaged citizens in the important conversations about how our sector and our society is organized. This is how we invest in a cultural democracy. This is how we build back a better Canada. Attending radically to all the ways that artists are experimenting with art-making processes right now is my hopeful proposal for bringing to light new insights that can help guide us into a post-pandemic world. From these artist-led discoveries that are grounded in values of care, creative possibility, social justice, interdependence, and sustainability, a new world will emerge. Thank you very much. Woo, made it through.
So what to take away from this? What I'm hearing is something that we're talking about in the art and climate movement, which is that artists are not being used to their full potential, to put it mildly.
Yeah.
and they're not being paid either for their work adequately. That's a parallel issue. But there's all of the other interconnected issues. You know, the term climate justice is used, but what are the underlying reasons why we are on the verge of collapse as a civilization, which is where I think we are. And I don't think the artists realize or talk about that enough, because if you look at the data, the scientific data, we are on the verge of collapse. Like there is no tomorrow, really. It has to be reinvented. So it's a time. It's a time for creative minds, but it's also a terrifying time where a lot of people are more comfortable in a kind of quasi-denial because it's so hard. Mm-hmm. It's hard for all of us to face what's coming for future generations, and yet we know, and you said it in your paper, that we have overcome things in the past. We have been here before, you know. Mm-hmm. What is your call, your main call to the arts community? You've said you want them to have more dialogue, but what would you like to see come out of the work that you've done?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I would first and foremost love to see artists really lean into experimentation with their creative practices and to share that what comes out of those practices, the learning and experimentation with each other. I mean, I think that's something that even as a community of art makers, we can get better at. But what that then also does is it starts to socialize learning about what art as a system of knowledge production is, right? And this is, I think, how we start to disentangle ourselves from the ways that we're trying to solve this challenge, or the ways that we're trying to, like, even thinking about what is happening right now as a problem to fix is maybe part of the dilemma mm-hmm. to begin with, right? And that art as a way of knowing, I think, is so critical, like these embodied processes that are about sensation, intuition, that, you know, these are the things that I work with in embodiment practice, that not surprisingly has become really prevalent in my work as of late. And so if artists lean into that and start to understand amongst ourselves as we sort of learn across our difference of approaches to our artistic practice, how this art as a way of knowing can be cultivated, and then how do those processes become ways of knowing that can, like, move out into the world in different ways, right? Like, how then do we engage more broadly with communities who are interested in these existential questions that we're facing? And so that's one of the key invitations, but really specifically, I'd like to see our system of cultural production care about that a lot more than it has in this moment of quote-unquote recovery.
Well, you and I have not similar backgrounds, but we're both artists who are worked in cultural policy and national gatherings and network and all that. But it comes back to my art practice is sound, right? So mm-hmm. doing a podcast for me is an art practice, sort of. And so I was interested when we had that conversation a few weeks ago, when you talked about embodied practice. that's so powerful, right? But it's hard to talk about. So could you talk a little bit more about what when you use the term embodied practice or embodied learning, what is that?
Yeah. Great question, and I'm happy to answer that question. I mean, I really think in its most simplest explanation, embodiment is how we are, right? So it's all of what has shaped our way of being in the world. I mean, we are in a world that disconnects us from our sense of embodiment. I mean, we're never in the literal sense disembodied, because of course we are embodied beings. But embodiment is also an understanding that we are not just like brains on sticks, that our knowledge systems and the way that we perceive the world is deeply informed by processes that are not isolated in the thinking mind, that actually we have these integrated knowledge systems that circulate through our nervous system, interoception, exteroception, proprioception, emotion, as well as conceptual thought as one of those systems. And so when we work with practices of embodiment, it's about acknowledging those other knowledge systems and how they shape our perception of reality. This is a very real thing, and neuroscience is starting to catch up in this regard to what many ancient cultures know and have practices around. Is that our physiological state informs how we perceive the world. And we are in a moment where most of us are under an incredible amount of stress, so we experience the activation of our stress response pervasively and sometimes at toxic levels. And so this is telling us how and when we feel safe, how and when we feel connected or belong, and how and when we feel a sense of respect or dignity. I mean, these are kind of the organizing principles of human beings: safety, belonging, and a sense of self-worth. And so if our nervous system is like in a constant state of being dysregulated because we're facing so much uncertainty right now, it's really not good for us, and it's very hard to do change work in that state. And so these practices are something that I've developed workshops around. I've been working with a lot of different organizations, including the Banff Center's Cultural Leadership Program, the Ivy Business School, through my work with SAPAMO and elsewhere, just bringing some of these practices so folks can feel well, because we can't do anything when we're not feeling well.
My mind is flowing here with ideas because I have a Qigong practice that I've been doing recently, in part because my liver isn't well, in part because I'm super stressed the way a lot of people are in spite of being retired. The climate emergency and the pressures that we put upon ourselves or we take upon ourselves. But I'm learning to relax my body and to tell my body that it's okay. And I encourage, and it sounds a little, personal, but it is something that we have to go through, is learn how to live with this stress. In a number of my episodes in the second season were about eco-anxiety, which is something a lot of people aren't aware that they're suffering from. People talk a lot about trauma, and there's so many different types of trauma, but we're essentially traumatized. We're traumatized by what we've done to our own environment, if you think about it that way. And art can heal so much. I don't try not to use that word, but art addresses so many of those underlying emotional, physiological, simply by listening, by expressing, by participating. And why wouldn't we do more of that? And why wouldn't that become more of a norm in our society, right? Art is a bit isolated. It's out there in a silo, a beautiful silo of greatness, It can continue to do what it does. I'm not saying it needs to change that much. It just has to play a different game, step up its game, because we need artists, and address the issue of precarity. By paying better fees, by having different social structures, by rethinking. You can rethink capitalism. I'm up for that because it's problematic, right? It's the assumption is endless growth, and all of these issues. I'm not an expert in these things, but I read about them, and when I heard your paper today, I was thinking, good for you for putting your finger on the tough ones, like institutional change, entitlement. It's a type of I don't know what words to use, but That's why I encourage people to read your paper and to respond and to think about the issues that you're raising from the point of view of, and I'm going to call it the mainstream arts community, in the sense of those organizations that are doing, good work in opera and theater and all that. They're part of the problem as well. And you're not really pointing your finger so much as you're opening your hand and saying, here's some issues, here's some references, here's an opportunity for dialogue. And I do think that dialogue, I mentioned it to the panel earlier, I think that dialogue is coming because the organization I work with, Scale, and others in Canada feel that need for us, in spite of COVID, finding whichever way we can to exchange, to have those conversations, to provide that mutual support, to support those who need more support, to identify those who need more support, and to get on with the business of making the arts and cultural sector as vibrant and as necessary, as essential as I think it needs to be.
I feel a great deal of empathy right now, actually, for everyone working in the cultural sector, actually, including those folks that are, running large institutions. I mean, what embodiment work has taught me is that we are shaped by the world we live in. So it's, how I have come to understand, how to be in this world is not something I chose or that I actually have agency over. It's something that, we are shaped by the system we live in, but that system also lives in us. And so we're in a moment of great truth and recognition of what that is. And so really that, for many of us, we're at the beginning. I mean, for folks who have been burdened and oppressed by the system as it was designed, their recognition didn't require a pandemic. I mean, they lived through these experiences. And, we to some extent can all identify with ways that the system might not be supporting us in our particular humanness in certain moments. So it's relatable. It's a relatable idea. Feeling a sense of not belonging, of being oppressed, of not feeling a sense of self-worth or not feeling safe are things that we as humans can all relate to. And so I think when we organize around issues of social justice and even, ecological, environmental justice, what we're actually organizing around is for all living beings to have a sense of safety, belonging, and respect. And so I think we need to approach this work with empathy. I think big change does have to happen, but we have to start to untangle that in ourselves as a priority, because otherwise we just keep enacting the culture that we have been brought up in, the social culture that we live in. That's the game we are in. So we don't want to set ourselves up to lose the game all the time. And that's why it's so hard to change. And then that's why we have to do it together. We have to organize collectively and start to just put the game away.
Well, I think I'll be observing that and probably participating in the dialogue and seeing how it fits into the larger picture of the ecological crisis. Because if you have a stronger arts and cultural sector, one that's more resilient and one that's more connected to other sectors, that's really firing on all cylinders, so to speak, you will have a better society, and you'll have more diverse voices that will challenge and not, like you say, empathy is a good approach, because we're all in it together. Some have been grossly mistreated in our system, the system that we sort of take for granted. We need to dismantle that system to a certain extent, rethink it. And I have so much faith in the power of art and artists, because I've seen it happen. That's people say, well, why are you so? Because I've seen it. Yeah, I've seen people be transformed by a play or by a poem or by a dance work or whatever, and I know that rich potential is there, and I'm happy that you are making a call to essentially self-organize, to rally the arts community, to talk to each other, and then to reach out as far as you can. Yes. to offer our services and to listen to what others have to teach us.
Yeah.
Because in the health sector and the Indigenous community, there's so much knowledge, so many things that we haven't experienced yet. And so that cross-pollination between the arts and everything else, I think that's where our future lies.
Yeah, well said.